Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to this keynote. I know that on the second day of a conference, being here in the morning is not always the easiest thing, especially if you've been out having fun with your colleagues last night, which I hope you were. As someone in security who has a penchant for staying up late myself, I have particular empathy for those of you who are really mainlining the coffee and really just trying to keep your eyes open. So I will do my best to keep you entertained by talking about some of the work that I've done and some of the perspectives that I have. So, Barry told you a little bit about me. My background is as a technologist. I'm a computer scientist, but my work is usually around being an advocate for users and a voice for users. And that's why I chose this picture of myself. Given the work that you do and the people that you serve, this is me in a healthcare setting, about 9 or 10 hours before giving birth to my second son. The parents in the room will appreciate that that little boy ended up being 9.5 pounds. So I consider that one of my life accomplishments right there. So, like I said, I think of myself as a user advocate. And you all deal with lots of different users. You focus on healthcare, you have patients in your purview, you have healthcare providers, you have healthcare administrators. And what I'd like you to do, sort of over the course of this talk, is really think about who your users are and what your relationship is to them. And I believe that this is the most essential factor in building secure systems, because security depends on your users. Security depends on understanding your users. Security depends on helping your users be successful in what they do so they can help you keep the systems that they are using secure. So, a little bit about what I do in Simply Secure. We are a small nonprofit that provides what we call open research and consulting services to various different organizations. And that means that we're really trying to bridge the gap between sort of ethical tech issues, such as security or privacy or transparency, with this human-centered thinking and this human-centered perspective. So that means that we get to work with technologists, such as yourselves, helping them sort of understand the people that they're trying to serve, but it also means that we get to work with designers and help them understand the technical challenges so that they themselves can be an advocate for the user within their teams. A big part of what Simply Secure does is what I call thinking beyond Silicon Valley. And this includes working with folks in the Global South. It includes working with folks in the internet freedom community, really trying to give voice to the people who have often very intense security needs. They're often experiencing physical threats of a kind that we don't experience, checkpoints where they have armed guards or armed members of gangs searching their phones, people who are under threat from their governments, frankly, people who are worried about their safety and their governments trying to surveil what they are doing. And a lot of what we do is working with open source organizations or software teams that are trying to serve these populations. We also try to do some research in Western contexts as well with people whose voices aren't necessarily heard. And I'll talk a little bit about one of the projects that we did in New York City, talking to folks whose perspectives are often not shared in Silicon Valley. Okay, so this talk, we're going to start out with a couple of definitions, sort of level the field and get some perspectives on what it is that we're considering. I'm going to share some stories. This is the really fun part of the talk. I get to tell you a lot of just anecdotes that I've gathered over the years. A lot of the ones that I'll be sharing today are from the doctoral research that I did, a lot of which was in a healthcare setting, but also in financial settings with large investment banks. And then I'm going to cover some principles and values that hopefully you can take home to your everyday jobs after DevCon. So, first off, what is security? Bill gave us sort of a plunge into the icy water a couple of minutes ago. Oh, this is important stuff. Data is being breached. But what is security really about? So we often think of security as being about hackers, people that are dressed all in black, people that wear dark clothes or are in dark rooms all the time. But of course, security is about a little bit more than that. So, how many of you actually know someone who works in security at Cerner? Raise your hands. Awesome, a good percentage. How many of them dress exactly like this? Probably not that many of them, right? Security is not a scary thing. Security is not about, someone sitting behind a desk saying, no, 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 thou shalt not do this. Security is, composed of a number of different tasks. At Cerner, like at many other places, it sounds like you think about end users. What are the features that your solutions offer that allow end users to engage with security and, protect the data that they are supposed to be using? You can think about security at sort of a code level. Is the code that you are writing secure? Is it going to have, various exploits? Are you unintentionally, opening the code base to exploits that you might not be aware of? Security also includes, the sort of runtime security of deployed systems. Can the network be penetrated? Do you have an operating system that, or a box that's been compromised, and how do you detect that, and what do you do with it? But what's really the goal of security? Is it to keep the bad people out? Yes. Is it, the sort of textbook answer that we're trying to maintain the confidentiality and integrity and availability of data? Yes, it's definitely those things. But unfortunately, those sort of definitions or perspectives tend to make us have that vision of security is about saying no, no, no. It's about, putting a lock on it, right? And you go and you look at any product, on an app store or just on the web, and if it has to do with security, it's got a lock. Like, why is it that that is what security is? Why is it that that is what our vision of security is? It shouldn't be about, impenetrably closing off data. It should be strategically protecting data. And I say strategically because if you think about it, and this is something that security nerds say all the time, but if you think about it, the most secure computer in the world is one that is in a locked room with a guard, not connected to the internet, and is turned off, right? That data is perfectly protected. No one is going to get access to it. No one is going to be able to do anything bad with it. But it's not particularly useful. And so when we think about security and we consider about security, when you consider security in your jobs as developers, as operations people, as designers, as whatever role you happen to have here at Cerner, we need to think about security not just as this absolute protection, but really strategic protection against specific, well-thought-out threats. And this is what security people, this line of thinking is what security people often talk about as threat modeling. The idea that you are going to sort of build a picture of the threats that you are trying to protect against, have some understanding of what those, the risk associated with those threats is, and make your security decisions accordingly. So if you have, I don't know what a good example is, if you have, a piece of a database that really only has information about when your, when your system was up or down. Like maybe that's sort of a history of your uptime. That is in no way, shape, or form going to be as important to protect or important to like prevent people from getting into as something that includes personal information about patients. Right? You can't protect those systems the same way. You have finite resources. You can't do everything all at once. And so you have to be strategic and you have to think critically and carefully about what it is that you're trying to protect and how much effort you have to put into it. And that makes sense. And when we think about clients, when we think about end users, when we think about people in the real world, they don't necessarily have a monolithic vision of what security is in their lives. So these are 4 women that Simply Secure has worked with in one way, shape, or form. All 4 of them care about security. Simply Secure has talked to all 4 of them. And they all care differently. They all have different visions. They all have different personal threat models. And I think it's really important when you're thinking about security to remember that security exists not just in the system. Security exists not just in your vision or your sort of absolute technologist perspective of what security should be, but security exists in the minds of the people who will be interacting with your system, and that perspective is really super important. So that leads me to one of my sort of first, observations, which is security, much like usability, is not a binary property. And what I mean by this is that we can't just say that something is secure or not. We can't just say, you can't do that because it's insecure. No, not necessarily, right? Like, you can say, you can't do that because it's going to put us at an unacceptable amount of, going to expose us to unacceptable risk according to our threat model. Like, yes, that makes a lot of sense. But it's important to remember that different people, different organizations, different clients, different sectors, different types of data have different threat models. Similarly, usability is not a binary property. We tend to think of something in many quarters, if you aren't already working with designers, if you don't already have design as part of your process, we tend to think of, that system, that's not usable. Or, that system, that's super pretty. It must be really usable, right? Because it's got the pretty buttons, it's got nice colors, it looks really modern, therefore it must be usable. No. Both of these things operate on a continuum. Both of these things must be defined as a function of the environment in which they are to be experienced. A system is only usable if it is usable by the people who actually need to use it. And that's why it's so important to talk to users and understand their perspectives. So, a lot of what I'll be talking about today is the result of qualitative research that I've done. And I wanted to say a word about qualitative research and sort of the role that it plays in the development process, because not everyone is necessarily familiar with it. Qualitative research is going and talking to actual real-life people and trying to understand their perspective. It's trying to immerse yourself in their world. It's trying to gather data, qualitative data, about the experiences that they have and how they view their needs and their limitations, their constraints, in such a way that for the purposes of software development, it can then be brought back to the development team and given to them so they can use it to inform the design decisions that they make. A lot of the qualitative research, as I said earlier, that I'll be talking about today was when I was in grad school, although some of it is from my work at Simply Secure as well. Another quick thing I wanted to point out, and I mentioned this or alluded to this earlier, everyone here has users. You might not be working on a client-facing solution, but you have users. You have human beings who benefit, experience, or interact with the work that you do. If you're a lawyer, you have users. If you're a designer, you have users. They might not be like working with a system that you coded, but they are still somehow interacting with it. They might be writing an application against an API that you developed. They might be using a server that's sitting in the data center that you manage. You have users, they have needs, they have constraints. Okay, stories from the field. I'm going to give you some spoilers first, because I want to make sure that you have the right context going into this. The moral of these stories is not that users are stupid. There's this tendency in the security community, and this is part of why I sort of got into this part of security. There's this tendency in the security community to say, those stupid users, listen to the horrible way they broke my system today. Or users are the weakest link. Or, sayings like that. No, hold on a second. If your users are failing, it's because you have failed. If your users are not successful using your system, interacting with it in a way that keeps themselves and their data and their organization's data secure, it's because you have not set them up for success. And so these stories are about helping you understand, helping you see the flip side of the coin, helping you get the perspective of what it's like to be a user in this weird, complicated, fast-changing world of information security so that you can try and have those perspectives inform the work that you do. Okay, so one of the big findings that I had from my doctoral research was that organizations are over-entitled. So if you're not familiar with identity and access management, in many companies, they talk about entitlements. Entitlements mean basically permissions. You have an entitlement that allows you to access a particular database. You have an entitlement that allows you to write to a file. These various different entitlements basically allow you to get your job done. And when I was talking to some financial institutions who have reasonably fine-grained control over the various entitlements for their various complex systems, I sort of quickly discovered this phenomenon that apparently in many different organizations you can trace the career trajectory of a person by looking at their entitlements, or at least you could back in the era that I was doing this research. Hopefully this has gotten fixed and has changed. But the idea was that you could look at, Jane, who is an SVP, and you could see entitlements associated with her job as an SVP. And you could see entitlements associated with her job as a vice president, and you could see entitlements associated with her jobs all of the way back to her first job that she had at the financial institution 15 years before. Why is that? Like, why is it that all of these entitlements exist? Shouldn't she be having these entitlements taken away? Right? Like, you'd think that if you're following the sort of security principle of least privilege, that you don't want people having access to stuff that they don't need, because then they can access stuff that they shouldn't be accessing, right? And it turns out that the human system, the sort of human organization that managed these entitlements, had zero incentive to ever remove entitlements. If you think about that, you need an entitlement to get your job done. So if you don't have an entitlement and you need to get your job done, you're going to call the help desk and you're going to be super cranky and you're going to get in touch with them and say, I need to do this thing, I need to do this thing, I need to get my job done. You're never going to call the help desk and say, oh, could you please remove these things I don't need anymore? And because there was no human process to sort of go through and remove the old entitlements, you had people that had access to wide swaths of the company that they really shouldn't have. And I think that one of the big takeaways from this was that people were thinking of the entitlement management system as a software product. They were thinking of it as a technology solution, as a technical problem. And so much of security is what we call a socio-technical problem. It's about the sort of social organization, the social processes, what are the human inputs. There's this notion in computer science, of a protocol, right? And you've got a back and forth between two machines. There's also a notion of what's called a ceremony. And the idea of a ceremony is that it's a protocol where you have a human component in the loop. So you have the human that's interacting with the computer or interacting with that computer, but the human is actually making decisions and engaging with the system and is sort of a unit or a component of the larger socio-technical system. So one idea to take home, if you deal with people, is to think of your software not just as having protocols, but as having ceremonies. And what is the role of the user? What are the responsibilities of the user? What are the assumptions that you are, when you're making assumptions or building up your threat model about your security system, or the security of your system, what is the burden that you are placing on the user? Okay. Context matters. So a lot of the work that you all do, I know, or a lot of your solutions operate in various different healthcare environments, including hospitals, where timeouts are super important. A little bit later, I'll be talking about a story of timeouts in a healthcare setting, but first I'd like to talk about a trading floor. Investment bankers, are super constrained in a lot of ways, in that they're trying to really get things done fast. If you have a trade that needs to go through because you're trying to take advantage of a particular window, you have to execute on it quickly. And so if you haven't touched your screen because you're watching some little graphs over here and you haven't touched this workstation and this workstation times out on you, you're going to be super duper cranky. And so at one of the organizations that I talked to, they were super upset, the users were super upset because they couldn't they felt like they couldn't get their work done because the machines were constantly timing out on them. And the security people were like, no, we have to have timeouts. We can't just leave these workstations unlocked, right? That's not safe. And so they had some back and forth, and finally, the folks on the trading floor were like, why? Why do we have to have these, why can't I have these unlocked? I'm sitting here with, I don't know how many people were on the floor, 100 different people that I know super duper well. We work very closely together every single day. We eat lunch at our desks. There's no way that some bad person is going to come in and sneak by us and sit down at my workstation when I'm not here, because all the people around me would notice this and they would raise a red flag. And so the security organization is like, oh, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense now that you mention it. We don't have to have timeouts in this context because the social environment, the sort of other controls, the informal controls that exist will detect a threat, will detect a malicious person coming in and trying to do things that they're not supposed to do. So the organization was able to actually relax its posture and allow the traders to do what they needed to do without having timeouts on their workstation because they really didn't need that control in place. Context matters. You have to think not just of the sort of security doctrine or sort of the technological vision of this is how it has to be, but really consider the environment in which people are working and what other opportunities might exist to protect data or to provide controls that are appropriate for the users. And this is important, thinking about healthcare. So, a lot of the work that I did for my doctoral research started out in the financial industry and then moved to the healthcare setting. And, in the financial industry, there's this push to really, control data. We want to make sure that people aren't accessing stuff that they're not supposed to be accessing because it's sensitive, we could lose money, blah, 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 blah. In many ways, that's flipped on its head in healthcare. Though one of the very first conversations that I had with some doctors when I went to a healthcare context, a doctor said to me, "I'm all for security as long as it doesn't get in the way of me taking care of my patients." And that's very profound because patient care is supreme. Patient outcomes are supreme. This is how healthcare providers, in my experience, think about the work that they do. Yes, it's very important that I take care of my patients' data because I don't want them to get hurt. I don't want their data to be exposed. Yes, I have all sorts of regulatory something, 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 something. But when push comes to shove, if I've got a person on the table and I'm an emergency room doc, I need to be able to access their data. I need to be able to see what I need to be able to see so I can take care of them because that is the most important thing that I do. And so much of the sort of security history and the security doctrine is not built up around that kind of environment. It's sort of an inversion of priorities. If we think about, the age of disco, where a lot of basic security concepts came about, we were in the Cold War. We were thinking about security in a military context, in an intelligence context. If you're working in a missile silo, you really, 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 really have to prevent the bad guys from doing something bad. That's really essential. It's much better to control the system a little bit too tightly because the outcome of having people have inappropriate access is so bad that it outweighs the flip side. Whereas in healthcare, in many contexts, it's the opposite, where it's most essential that people have access if they need it, and that you protect the data and that you control it and you monitor it and you make sure that they're not doing bad things with it, but that you really need to make sure that they have access if they need it. And so context matters. Understanding the environment matters. I know this is a bit of a refrain, but thinking about security is not just going online, reading a book, taking a course, and saying, aha, this is how I do security, and this is going to apply in all situations. It's about understanding the environment in which your solutions are deployed, understanding the people and the constraints and the needs that they have. Users really want to do the right thing. How many of you have ever used written a password on a sticky note, or let's say this. How many of you have seen a password written on a sticky note in a professional setting? All of you. It turns out that the security people, this is like your number one way to drive them really batty in most contexts. Most security people are like, oh my God, that's awful, that's really horrible. So one of the financial institutions that I talked to had gone through this huge campaign to get rid of sticky notes on Windows for the workstation login. So it seemed like, most users were okay with remembering the passwords for the various systems, various applications and web applications that they used on the workstation. But for whatever reason, probably because they only had to log into the workstation once a day, they were writing the workstation password on a sticky note and putting it on the computer. And they reached a point where users had seemed to stop doing that. And that was great. They were really happy. Like, okay, all the users seem to have gotten rid of their sticky notes. We're feeling pretty good. And the chief information security officer was thinking about it. And he was like, wow, that happened really fast. And we really didn't give them like a better solution. They're still only asked to log into these workstations once a day. How is it that they're suddenly all... So he went in, and he picked up a keyboard, and he flipped it over, and next desk, flipped it over, next desk, flipped it over. There were all the sticky notes. And so it was really easy. Oh, right, that's my... Okay, okay, I'm going to type in my password like that. So the security instinct might be, the technologist instinct might be to go and chastise the users and tell them this is really bad, maybe give them a password manager, maybe do all these things, but generally make them feel like they're bad people, right? But this CISO took the nice step of actually talking to people. Why are you doing this? What's going on here? Well, I only have to log into it once a day, or I only have to log into it so often. It's not a big thing. And it doesn't matter anyway, said the users, because I have to log in to the applications on my computer, and that's where the data is, and that's what really matters to this organization. Yes, I'm sure that it's bad that I'm signing into this, computer in a relatively what you consider an insecure way, but it's okay because I'm not writing down the password for the database that has all the client information. I'm not writing down the password for the, the thing that allows me to execute trades. This user wasn't just being malicious. This user wasn't just trying to make the security people's lives tough. This user was trying to do the right thing given the constraints that they had. They were making a rational decision, trying to get their job done within the sort of world that the security people had provided for them. This is one of my favorite anecdotes. So in one of the healthcare organizations that I talked to, they were having a big problem with de-authentication. And from what I understand from dinner last night, this is still an issue that hospitals are dealing with. You walk up to a workstation, you authenticate, you sign in some way, and then you need to walk away and go do, interact with the patient, go to a different workstation. What happens to that workstation? You need to sign out in some way. In this healthcare organization, they were having huge issues with workstations being left signed in everywhere. Users didn't have a very strong incentive to sign out. They didn't really see a huge value to signing out. They trusted the people that were working with them. You can go into a long story about why it is that they felt like they didn't need to sign out, but that's how they felt. And so the IT people said, aha, we're going to have a technical solution to this. We are going to have a proximity sensor. And this was, back in the 2000s. This is pre-2010. So I don't remember exactly or know exactly what kind of proximity sensor was it. Was it infrared? Was it something else? But it was this little thing that you set next to the computer. And it's supposed to, when you sign in to the computer, it's supposed to detect that there's a person here. And keep that person signed in sort of consistently for whatever period of time until the person walks away and it no longer detects that there's a person there. And it's going to say, aha, the person has walked away. It's now safe to sign them out. Of course, it turns out that this system was horribly flaky. It didn't really work very well. It wasn't reliable. It was signing people out when they were in the middle of trying to do their thing. They were trying to do their data entry, trying to get information right before they walked into a patient room. It was making their lives miserable. So the users started complaining. Luckily, this is just a trial run, but the users started complaining. They started complaining very loudly. They found a couple of these things ripped off the computers and thrown in the trash can. And then they went silent. And some members of the IT staff were like, great, they finally adapted. It worked. We've gotten them to accept our technological intervention, and they're now being safely de-authenticated, and everything is okay. Wait a minute, what is that? Some clever user had decided, or had discovered, and it spread like wildfire, that if you took one of the styrofoam cups from the cafeteria and you put it over the proximity sensor, it was very happy to believe that there was something in front of it for all time. Users are really clever. Users will try to tell you what it is that they need. Users will try to tell you when the thing that you're doing for them is just not working. And if you don't listen, they will apply that cleverness and they will apply that ingenuity to work around your system. So you need to keep your ears open and you need to be listening to what they're saying to you so that you can hear the warning signs when they're trying to circumvent, before they try to break your system, before they try to work around these controls and affordances that you have so carefully crafted. Culture matters too. Investment banks are very different places than hospitals. This shouldn't be a big surprise for anyone. Investment bankers are a lot less patient than doctors. You tend to think of, and particularly a lot less patient than non-doctor clinicians. So a lot of the people, as I'm sure many of you know, a lot of the people in healthcare environments who are doing the data entry and interacting with the systems that you build are not necessarily doctors, but are nurses or other clinicians. Those people are not given a lot of agency in their organization. They are not necessarily super well respected. They do not necessarily feel that their IT organizations are going to listen to them if they speak up. In the financial industry, it's a very different story. People, and I'm making generalizations here. I don't want to, present just a stereotype, but this is sort of the sense that I felt. There's much more of a culture in the financial industry of speaking up when they can't get their job done. And that's because of various cultural reasons, but there's this real sense that, gosh darn it, I can't get my job done. You lost me $1 million. You lost our bank $1 million today because I couldn't sign into the system that I was supposed to sign into. Luckily in healthcare, the outcomes, the sort of downside is, in most cases, smaller. It's pretty rare, usually, that a nurse not being able to access data is going to result in a super critical bad outcome for users, for patients, I hope. I'm sure that's actually, there are horrible stories where that has not been the case, but sort of the day-to-day grind, the day-to-day, downbeating experience that a nurse has trying to work with a system that doesn't work for them is not something that they're going to be able to go to their boss and say, I lost $1 million. And so this sort of cultural difference makes for a very different relationship between the IT organization and the user base in a financial organization and in a healthcare organization. And so being mindful of the organizational culture, of the organization's ability to talk to its own users, to introspect into the environment that it has created for itself is essential. There's no really great answer or insight here other than different organizations are different, and being aware of that is really important. So for my last story, I'd like to move a little bit away from the healthcare and financial industries and tell you a bit about a study that we did in New York City. This is my colleague Amy talking with one of our study participants. This study was with economically disadvantaged folks in Brooklyn and in Harlem who use mobile messaging in one way, shape, or form. So either text messaging or an app like WhatsApp or various different services that are out there. And we were conducting this research sort of from the perspective of an end-to-end encrypted secure app. What would it take to get this end-to-end encrypted secure app in the hands of people like this? People who are economically disadvantaged, are they using this app? Are they aware of it? Are they aware of apps like it? What do they have a need? Do they perceive that they have a need for it in their daily lives? And security people will, particularly in the sort of internet freedom community, will tell you everyone needs end-to-end encryption. This is for you and you and you. This is really important that you use this to protect your data against surveillance from all sorts of people. And so they'll talk about, they'll use the language that they have to talk about how their app is open source and how it's encrypted and how it has this and that and the other thing. And Amy went and she talked to some folks in New York City. And the first thing they said was, open source? You're sharing my data with everyone? They didn't, that language didn't make sense to them. And end-to-end encryption, they really didn't have an intuitive understanding what that was about. And so Amy talked to them about, well, what are the security threats that you face in your world? Well, let me tell you, when I go to my job at Foot Locker, every day, my boss takes my phone because he's afraid that I'm going to use it on my shift. And so I don't get to have my phone, I don't have physical control over my phone most of the day because my boss has it. And so I have to be really careful to not have anything ever show up on my lock screen that I don't want my boss to see. And from a security, the security nerds in the crowd are like, you lose physical control over your device? Like that's really scary. Like, oh my gosh, you can do so much. If you have like hours of uninterrupted access, physical access to someone's device, you can basically do anything. Like that's really horrible. People in this, study talked a lot about how, culturally or sort of in their sort of social environment, they don't feel like they have ownership over their phones, both because maybe their bosses are able to access them, but also because maybe they're on a shared mobile plan with an boyfriend that, they would really like to move off of that shared mobile plan, but they can't afford to, and so they're stuck on this mobile plan with the ex-boyfriend who maybe, doesn't have the strongest morals and is maybe willing to, cut off their service when he feels like it, or reroute it to a different phone, or do all sorts of other nefarious things that makes them feel very insecure about their experience. People also worry about when you have a group of friends, in this context, like if you bring your phone to you when you go to the bathroom, your friends might make fun of you. Like, why are you bringing your phone to the bathroom? Don't you trust us? And so there's this sort of cultural experience, which is very different than the experience that I have with my friends, that if you aren't willing to leave your phone and make it available to the people around you, that you must be trying to hide something. And so if you have something that you are trying to hide, you might do things, and I wish I had included this, you might do things like have certain contacts in your address book be named with nothing but emojis. So instead of having, Bill James, in your address book, you might have like a horse and two smiley faces. Like something that will only make sense to you but not make sense to some random person in your social circle who's going to pick up your phone and start fiddling around with it. People in this cohort also valued disappearing messages tremendously. They saw disappearing messages, the ability of a message to sort of expire or go away within their secure messaging app, as being the most important security feature. And this is something that you talk to security nerds who are developing secure messaging, and they were like, what? That's not secure. Like, here are the 13 ways in which I can break that. And that doesn't matter, because as the security person, you know that. But if you're trying to provide your services and your expertise to this person, you have to understand what they care about. You have to offer features and you have to offer things that will help them feel secure in order for them to even consider engaging in what your definition of security is. Okay, so some principles and values to take home. These are the things that I've covered so far. These are in many ways baby steps, though, right? This is just the beginning. This is stuff that I can tell you, and you can sit here and you can listen to it and you can say, oh yeah, okay, users, yeah, rah, users. Security is all about the user. But how are you going to apply this in the job that you do? How are you going to actually take this home and incorporate it into your practice? How are you going to actually sort of build your work around your users? So one thing to remember, and this is sort of a bit of a higher level takeaway, security is always what we in human research call a secondary task. People always want to get their job done. People, yes, I care about security, but I want to take care of my patients. I care about security as long as it's not getting in the way of what I need to do. Security is a secondary task. I will do it as long as you make it reasonably easy and accessible to me, and as long as it doesn't get in the way of me doing my job. If you give me a choice between, a secure end-to-end encrypted app that doesn't let me talk to my mom and, JRandom just found it off the internet app that my mom is on, I'm going to choose the one that my mom is on because I care much more about talking with my mom and actually communicating with her than I care about trying to live up to this vision of security that is not realistic for the life that I lead. Users want to do the right thing. Users will try and tell you what it is that they need If you listen, you have the opportunity to try and make their worlds better. You have the opportunity to engage with them in designing a system that will actually meet their needs. But if you don't listen to them and if you're not receptive, if you don't have the human processes, the technological processes, the time, the focus to engage with your users and really hear what they're doing, if listening, I think this is the right terminology, if listening to users is an and job, it's not going to happen. And those users are going to find ways to quietly and very cleverly break your system. And that's really important. It's not the users are doing something wrong. You're going to be frustrated. You're going to be upset with them. Those stupid users, they're making my world awful. But ultimately, it's up to you to take responsibility for that. Usability is a necessary prerequisite for security. If users can't use your system, they're going to break it. And so if your system is not usable, it's not going to be secure. User education. This is one of the things that a lot of technologists always say, but we just have to tell the users, right? We're just going to go say, oh, user, you really need to do this thing that is really hard for you, that's totally unintuitive, that doesn't make sense given your workflows or your work culture or any of the environment that you work in. I just need you to do the thing that I say that you need to do because. Doesn't actually work like that. User education in some contexts can be useful. If you have a brand new system, you need to provide often explicit training. I know that when you're working with a new client, I'm sure you have a whole division of Cerner that specializes in going and training people on the new system and engaging with them and interacting with them and helping them understand how the system works. And as long as that education is about just helping them map the pathway of the things that they need to do and how to map that into the system, and as long as that pathway doesn't have too many uphills and is more sort of a gentle downslope that they can walk along to get their job done, that's great. It's just sort of showing them the path. We're going to walk along the path together. This is great. If you're, if the instruction that you're giving is more, here's a guidepost that you have to go this way, and they're sort of trying to pushing the analogy a little bit, but if they're trying to sort of thrash through a jungle in order to get their jobs done, that's not really going to work. User education cannot fix bad design. Your system needs to be designed with your users in mind. It needs to be designed to accommodate their work processes. It needs to be designed to help their work processes. And user education is just to kind of help them get unstuck in a couple of little places if they need it. All right. So the questions that I want to leave you with are, who are your users? Like I said, everyone has users. You might not think of yourself as having users, but you do. Who are your users? Can you identify them? Can you say, what their needs are? Can you say what their constraints are? Can you say something more than, oh yeah, they're just nurses and doctors? Like what makes them tick? What do they value? What do they need? What are their perspectives on the security constraints that they operate under? What are their security goals? Do they trust you? And trust is built, this is something that the folks introducing me mentioned, is trust. Trust is not just about, oh, Cerner is a reputable company. Trust is embodied in how you show your users that you care about them. Trust is embodied in how you show your users that you understand what they need. If a user can trust that they're going to sit down and try and interact with the work that you do, and it's going to be predictable, and it's going to be reliable, and it's not going to be hard to use, and ideally it might even make them a little bit happy because it's enjoyable, then they will have trust in you and have faith in you and give you the benefit of the doubt when you're asking to do something that sometimes is a little uncomfortable. Security is most successful. Uncomfortable security tasks or onerous security tasks are most successfully accomplished when there's a trust relationship between the user and the developer, and that user is willing to sort of be like, oh, yeah, the software is asking me to do this thing. Occasionally, I can handle it. I can get it done. I trust them. They understand what it is that I'm trying to do. Who are your users, and how do you learn from them? Today, you're at DevCon, it's awesome. Next week, you're going to be home, back in your jobs. Most of you don't have direct access to the security team or teams. Most of you don't have direct access to design teams. It's upon you to seek out this information. It's upon you to sort of figure out who your users are. Maybe you can hunt down a designer who's worked on your solution. Maybe you can go talk to them. Maybe you have the opportunity here to talk to people that are actually users of the work that you do. How are you going to find opportunities to learn from them? This doesn't have to be an and job. This doesn't have to be a big thing. Just what are the sort of small interactions, the small chances that you have to learn about the experiences that the people you are trying to serve have, and figure out ways to work that into the work that you do. Because ultimately, I know that you're doing this work. Maybe most of you really love to code and your passion is coding, but that's not the end story about the work that you do. You're doing this work. You're working for a company like Cerner. You're working for a healthcare company because ultimately you want to see the world be a better place. You want the stuff that you do to be in the hands of people. You want it to be successful. You want it to be useful. You want it to improve their experiences. So security is a process, not a product. And indeed, all of software is a process, not a product. That process, your responsibility for it is on you. And so I wish you courage and keep up the good work. Thank you.